This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale. This is a podcast where we talk about environmental justice, justice for animals, justice for the climate, and think about ways to move forward out of our present crisis. And today I'm very excited to share that conversation with Pattrice Jones. She is a co-founder of Vine Sanctuary, a refuge for farmed animals. And she's also written a lot on issues related to animals and other forms of injustice. But today we're mainly talking not so much about her writing, but just her work at Vine Sanctuary and what type of place it is. As regular listeners know, I've been doing a 4-part series on animal agency over the last month or two, and this is part 4. And I think it's a really nice way to wrap up a lot of the ideas we've discussed over the last few weeks about animal creativity and animal politically expressing themselves, and really look at a place in Vine Sanctuary where these ideas get put into action, where the humans involved really try to make it a place, as Pattrice says, where birds can be birds, where cows can be cows, and where the animals in some sense have a say in running the place. I'll let her explain what she means by that, but I think it's a very fascinating and in some ways utopian, I mean that in a good way, conversation. The series on animal agency will wrap up not on the podcast itself, but in a book club at the end of June 27th. That's a Tuesday. Over Zoom at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, we'll be discussing The Plague Dogs by Richard Adams. Some of you may know him as the author of Watership Down, but we'll be discussing The Plague Dogs, which is a novel about dogs escaping from a research lab facility. So I'm sure there will be a lot to discuss there. And for those who aren't readers, there's a movie of The Plague Dogs as well that you are welcome to watch and join the conversation. Okay, I've listed all the usual ways of supporting this podcast in the episode description, as well as a link to Vine Sanctuary, so you can learn more about their work and about Pattrice and support Vine Sanctuary if you are so inclined. As always, please consider supporting this podcast as well on Patreon with a small monthly donation to keep it going. Without further ado, here is Pattrice Jones. Hi, I'm here with Pattrice Jones, the co-founder of Vine Sanctuary, which is an LGBTQ-led refuge for farmed animals. Pattrice, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hi, so I thought we could start by just, describing life at Vine Sanctuary, if you could tell us about what that is.
Well, Vine Sanctuary is an LGBTQ-led farmed animal sanctuary located in Springfield, Vermont, which is on the traditional homelands of the Abenaki people, as well as the traditional homelands of indigenous animals such as beavers and wild turkeys. About half of our land is reserved as wildlife refuge, and then the other half is occupied by our multi-species community, which includes upwards of 500 farmed animals, including chickens and cows and goats and sheep, turkeys, ducks, geese, emus, alpacas, one pig, and I'm sure I've forgotten somebody, as well as a considerably smaller number of humans who are working to take care of these survivors of the multifaceted war on animals waged by our species. Non-human sanctuary residents include survivors of animal agriculture, including the beef and poultry and egg industries and dairy industry, but also survivors of animal testing, of hunting, of various uses of animals in entertainment, such as petting zoos. Animals come to the sanctuary through various means. Some have liberated themselves by escaping or fighting back. Some have been seized by authorities due to quite extreme cruelty and neglect. Farmed animal welfare laws are extremely minimal, so the level of suffering that is going on before authorities actually seize animals from farmers is truly extreme. And then others are surrendered. We also were the first sanctuary to figure out how to rehabilitate roosters used in cockfighting. So a number of the birds here were seized by authorities in the course of busting up cockfighting rings or breeders of birds for cockfighting. And again, some animals just free themselves and find their way to us.
Yeah, so how you said you were the co-founder. How long has Vine been going on, and how did you decide to start Vine?
It all started 22, 23 years ago in the part of the country where factory farming of chickens was invented and perfected. That's called the Delmarva Peninsula. It's got parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And it's a small peninsula where the poultry industry kills and cuts up more than 1 million birds every day. We, co-founder Miriam Jones and I, moved to that part of the country without realizing that we would be surrounded by factory farms. But we were, in fact, we were on a quite small property, literally surrounded by factory farms. And shortly after moving there, literally on our way to the bank to start our local bank account, we encountered a chicken in a ditch who had jumped or fallen from a truck headed for a slaughterhouse. So we brought her home, and she turned out to be a he, and then needed some companions. So we let the local humane society know that anybody else who found birds could bring them to us. Then I had the opportunity to actually go into a factory farm to rescue any birds who the chicken catchers had left behind. And 23 years later, here we are.
What does a typical day for you on the sanctuary look like?
Well, it's probably more interesting to hear what the typical day at the sanctuary is like overall rather than my day,
Yeah, let's do that then.
because my day is often caught up at this point in things like recording a podcast or doing fundraising, which is not interesting at all. But a typical day at the sanctuary starts at sunrise and ends at sunset. We have two adjoining properties, one of which we call the valley, and the other one is up a steep driveway, and we call that the hill. The valley includes several coops with mostly chickens, a few ducks, but all birds. The hill has two different areas. One is called the Commons, and that is where goats and sheep and some cows needing special care, elders, juveniles, people recovering from injuries, newcomers, live, along with lots and lots more birds. So all of the mammals and a lot of the birds are up the hill. And then if we go even further high up into the wooded, rocky, mountainous terrain of the back pasture, that is where the hardy herd of cows live. And they have their own barn. There are on average, there are about 40 cows here at the sanctuary, most of them in the back pasture. So a morning starts at sunrise. We need at least two people to handle morning chores, one in the valley and one up the hill. With the morning begins with all of the coops being opened, and I always wish that animal advocates were there because then they would never, ever, 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 ever be tempted to call themselves the voice of the voiceless, because it is very loud. And if
Mhm.
you are even a little bit late in opening the doors, you will hear it. You will hear the complaining. Even after you open, folks will be mooing to each other, talking to each other, quacking to each other, talking to each other about you and why you're moving so slowly and why aren't you filling the water troughs more quickly. And you would be quite clear that you are nobody's voice, because folks have their own voices. So yes, that is the thing that people are doing then. We are filling up the water bowls and the water troughs and filling up the feed bowls and making sure that everybody who's on a special diet gets their special diet. Anybody who needs meds gets their meds. And everybody spreads out to forage in the pastures and the yards and the fields and the woods, and the humans get busy cleaning barns and coops. And then it's a little bit different depending on the season. In the summer, you're making sure that everybody's cool enough and that the water stays fresh and full. In the winter, you're making sure everybody stays warm enough and breaking up ice. And then the day goes on, and then eventually it becomes evening or sunset, at which point the birds go back into their coops, and folks get their evening meals if they get special meals, meds if they get meds, and we close all the doors, and everybody goes to sleep.
I'm glad you talked about the sound because I remember the first time I visited a sanctuary that was mostly you know, either formerly farmed birds or former quote unquote pets or backyard chickens who had found their way to the sanctuary, um, which was Hen Harbor in California. The first time I went, absolutely the first thing I noticed was the noise, that they're all just clucking and honking and yeah, I've heard animal advocates as well describe themselves as the voice for the voiceless. I think there's an organization called that, and I you're right that it's a mistake to think about other animals as being voiceless.
Yeah, and it's not just a physiological mistake. I mean, I say this jokingly, but if you're thinking of yourself as the voice of the voiceless, as opposed to the voice of the unheard, as opposed to an amplifier of the voices of those who aren't being listened to adequately, then that opens the door for a fair amount of hubris and heroism and a feeling like you are the hero, you are the center, you are the one. And that still centers the human, right?
Mm-hmm.
But our perspective from a sanctuary, and it's very clearly a sanctuary perspective, engendered by living in a multi-species community with people of all species who are adequately respected. Our perspective is that the true leaders of the animal liberation movement must be animals. And we humans should be thinking of ourselves as allies and thinking really hard about how to figure out what those for whom we are advocating would like us to do, rather than allowing our own preferences or philosophies or wishes to feel like this kind of a person or that kind of a person guide what we do. Really attend closely to what animals are saying about what they want, and do our best to figure out what they might like us to do.
Yeah, so 2 episodes ago, I spoke with philosopher Ava Mayer
Mm-hmm.
about the concept of interspecies democracy and looking at other animals as political agents, as having
Mm-hmm.
language. And she actually, in our interview, she talked about Vine as a place where experiments and looking at what it's like to, let other animals guide their own lives looks like. And I'm curious if any examples come to mind of ways in which your practices at the sanctuary have been changed or transformed due to attending to the other animals' needs and desires.
On the one hand, I can think of 100,000 examples. On the other hand, I'm scrambling for even one. But while I'm thinking about that in the back of my mind, let me disclose that from the inception of what is now Vine Sanctuary and what was originally called the Eastern Shore Chicken Sanctuary, from the beginning, we have been asking these questions. So we decided after rescuing the first few birds and deciding to go ahead and make it an official sanctuary that our motto would be let birds be birds.
Mm,
And our idea was that we were as likely as anybody else to really not think about chickens as birds, but to think of them as some domesticated entity, juveniles under the with a need for human control. But that's the propaganda of the people who exploit chickens, right?
right.
But that they are birds. Okay, well, what do birds want? That was our first question. What do birds want, and what do birds like these birds want? So we learned about the wild jungle fowl in South Asia, who are the ancestors, the still wild living ancestors of all domesticated chickens. We learned that with a few exceptions, modern so-called domesticated chickens are genetically indistinguishable from wild jungle fowl. They're the same species. And wild jungle fowl live freely in the forest, conducting their own affairs just fine. We learned that chickens become feral more easily than any domesticated animal other than cats, and that flocks of feral chickens live in Hawaii,
Wow.
in Florida, in Canada. I've seen a flock in Hawaii, mostly descendants of escapees from cockfighting. And so we learned that if the habitat is okay and the climate is okay, now notice that where the feral chickens are living freely is in warmer climates than even we were in Maryland, and certainly warmer than here in Vermont. So of course they would need support. They need housing and food and all of that. But our idea was that our job was to allow them to, insofar as possible, rewild themselves.
Mm,
Our job was to create a habitat that was as close as possible to the habitat that their bodies evolved for, that they probably wanted in some deep embodied way. Trees, underbrush. These are forest birds, right? People imagine chickens in, I don't know, yards, empty yards that are either dirt or grass and they don't have trees. Well, that's really scary for a chicken. Then they're constantly under, they don't have anywhere to hide from aerial predators. They're forest birds. So we decided that we would set up our habitat as 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 insofar as possible, as close to the habitat as they would like. That if any bird or birds wanted to be friends with us, we would be super happy about that and just be so eager to be friends, but that we would not make any effort to in any way tame or further domesticate, acclimate to humans, anybody. That we would understand that their most important relationships would be with each other, and that our job was to set up the situation in which they could self actualize themselves. And so that's what we tried to do. And then we relocated up here to Vermont in 2009 for various reasons, but one of them was so that we could have more land and begin taking in survivors of dairying, which, as feminists, we see as reflective of both sexism and speciesism, just like cockfighting. And so when we started taking in cows then we were like, okay, so then that motto there has got to be let cows be cows.
Mhm.
What do they want? Oh well, they are also the descendants of forest creatures. So we better make sure they have woods. And as others came, we did the same. So this is a long answer to your how have things changed in response to what animals have told you, but because I wanted you to be clear that from the beginning, that's been our
Mhm.
that's been our way to try and figure out what animals might want. Now, once folks moved in, then they often make very clear that they don't like this or they do like that, or you thought that this area would be one that everybody would like, and they're like, nah, we're not interested in that, but this one over here that you're blocking us from, we actually would like to be over there. So people will repurpose, we'll build something that we think is going to have one purpose, and then and maybe it does have that purpose for a while, but then others will take it over. Right now we have a structure that we had built for a pig that is now, in fact, the goat nap area. So it's a constant. There's so many, every day, there, what we're doing is guided by what the folks in our care are telling us they want, right?
Mhm.
Because saving somebody's life doesn't mean that you get to be the boss of them.
Right.
So uh, we are aware of the wider world, of course. In the eyes of the wider world, the animals in our care are our property. But that doesn't mean we have to treat them like property.
Mhm.
Uh, there are times when we know things that they don't know, right? So we know that the area beyond a particular fence is not considered our property. We know that if cows were to breach the fence and go over there, they might be vulnerable to hunters, and they don't know that.
Mhm.
So we have knowledge they don't know, um, and it's something. And if they knew, then they would stay away from that danger zone, right?
Mhm.
So we certainly do consider ourselves both not just allowed but required when we have information they don't have, um, to exercise what might feel like authority, um, to protect health or welfare either of an animal themselves or of some other animal, right? But unless it is necessary to preserve health or safety, we step back
Yeah.
at all times. And so, like every single day, every little decision is guided by paying attention.
Yeah. No, that's such an incredible answer because I think it gets at I don't know, this may be gonna sound silly at first, but the most recent episode I was talking to my friend about Jurassic Park, um, and kind of how the whole problem is that they think they can create this park where the animals will behave a certain way, and in fact, animals behave how they want to behave and have their own, make their own decisions that you aren't yours to have pre-decided for them. Um, and if we think about how, there is a fence, like you said, because of the conditions of the outside world, there is, it may be in one lens is still a condition of captivity, even at Vine
Absolutely.
Sanctuary.
Absolutely. We're at the same time captors and caregivers. And we have to be aware of that, even though it's really, really hard to think of yourself in that way.
Mhm.
You have to, because just deciding to be vegan or deciding to start a sanctuary, that doesn't magically make you not a speciesist. That doesn't magically take away all of the deeply embedded presumptions of human supremacy that are there from your upbringing. So unless you take great care, you will try to boss everybody. You will presume that you know better. Um, we're guided by two principles from disability rights as well, and that's called the presumption of competency and the privilege of risk. Are you familiar with those?
I'm not.
So those are two really big, important concepts in disability rights, and the presumption of competence comes in where um, so often uh, helpful people, so people who think of themselves as helpful, able people who think of themselves as helpful, they might start to push somebody's wheelchair without even asking them, or might presume that a person with a particular cognitive disability or a particular psychiatric disability can't make their own decisions about particular things. And so the presumption of competence says simply this, that, if this is an adult, then you presume that they are competent to make their own decisions unless you have evidence otherwise. But the
Mm-hmm.
presumption is competence. In both ableism and speciesism, the presumption tends to be incompetence, right? It's like you've got to prove to me that you're competent.
Mm-hmm.
But within disability rights, we say, nah, you should presume that the person is competent unless you've got evidence otherwise. Same thing with us. If this is an adult animal who might well be my elder in terms of their relative age, uh, I'm going to presume that they are competent to make their own decisions unless I have reason to know that they're not, because I have knowledge they don't have, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I might know that that cough they have is likely to be a sign of pneumonia and that penicillin will help it. And so in that instance, no, they're not competent to know whether or not should take penicillin because they don't even know that penicillin exists. Um, but in terms of, do they prefer this pasture or that pasture? What time do they want to eat? Where do they want to go during the day? Who do they want to have be their friends? Those are all decisions that I shouldn't have a say in. They
Right.
don't get to decide for me who my friends are going to be or where I go or don't go. So presumption of competence. And then privilege of risk is trickier. One of the trickiest things in a sanctuary is that you are constantly making ethical decisions and practical decisions that have no clear right or wrong answer, uh, and and in which you're often balancing competing goods or competing harms, and um, and one of those is safety versus self-determination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, like, so we wouldn't have that fence if we went all the way into self-determination. Then there wouldn't be the fence, and the person could wander into the shooting range.
Right.
Uh, 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 Safety, if we went in the other direction, is what farmers will often claim, right? They'll keep cows in a barn 24/7 and say, well, otherwise they might trip over rocks and get hurt,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we have rocky terrain. People can, they can trip. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, the safety side would be lock everybody up all the time. Uh, Obviously, you're going to choose somewhere in between there, but exactly where and upon what reason? And uh, Within disability rights, there is this idea that part of being an adult is having the privilege to choose to do things that are somewhat risky,
Mm-hmm.
and not, as long as you're competent to make that decision, then nobody has the right to stop you from it.
Yeah. I think if I try to describe a farmed animal sanctuary to a friend who, even a vegetarian friend or, a friend who likes animals but who maybe hasn't been to one, as a place where animals from species who are typically farmed are able to kind of wander around on their own and live their own lives, it might not on the surface sound like, how is that different from keeping my backyard hen for their eggs or whatever? Or how is that different from, I don't know, like a humane egg farm or whatever, quote unquote. But the ethos is so radically different, and then what it makes possible is so different, because I think what we aren't trained to consider is that there actually is a like range of possibilities for what a chicken life looks like. And your description here is like stirring a utopian instinct in me of, the way that lives could go that is so radically different from how they go now. And I think, even when I have been to sanctuaries with groups of other vegans and animal rights activists, I'm not saying this to throw them under the bus, but I've seen, people kind of, we all want, right, the photo op with the chicken,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and can be, a little aggressive in trying to, hold the chicken to get the photo when clearly they don't
Right.
want it. And this is people who, I think have thought more about this
Abs-
than the
Absolutely.
typical person, but just that we really haven't, it takes time to go far enough to like really respect this other animal as an autonomous being.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
mhm,
It's deeply ingrained, and so uh, uh, we don't have as many visitors as most sanctuaries do, and we're always really careful and prepare people, and so we haven't had many incidents like that. But I hear stories about vegans visiting other sanctuaries. I hear stories about the photo ops, etc. And that's just. But I know within my own heart, I still have to. It's 20 some
mhm,
years, and I'm still periodically catching myself just presuming that because I'm human, I know better, or I'm not really adequately attending. Uh, so it's a process.
yeah, and people do it with their dogs too. With
Oh, yeah.
they, I think, have genuine love in their heart for their dogs, and they, you know, hug them when they are trying to get away, or whatever else. And
Well, well,
um,
and I mean, and this is where things are murky because heaven knows humans will also hug or worse humans they claim to love who are clearly showing that they
mhm,
don't want to be hugged or fondled or whatever the case may be. And so, here again, we have another kind of an intersection around really respecting other people's bodily autonomy
mhm.
and not allowing our own desires uh, to take precedence.
Yeah, no, I think the respect portion of it is so important. Um, you know, you can love a chicken as you might love a toy, is a different kind of love than as a whole autonomous being who may or may not want to hang out with you.
Right.
Um, so what? Gosh, there's so many different directions I could go based on everything you've said, but insofar as, right, you have a fence now because there is, you know, there's risk outside of it. What like in your future dreams,
Mm.
what allows you to, or like what is the future of what a sanctuary could be? What do you wish you had the space for, the resources for, the legal permission for, the safety for, to kind of become even less captor and more caretaker?
I think we're a long ways away from not having a need for sanctuaries.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Certainly, I would like I would like there to be land enough and space enough for currently captive kinds of animals to rewild themselves and care for themselves without human intervention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So uh, just as I've seen the wild chickens in Hawaii, where I was hiking in a forest and saw a whole flock who, the forest is big enough and they're escapees and they can just live their lives free. And the cows in our back pasture, if we had lots more land, they wouldn't need us to give them hay all the time because
Mhm.
they would have enough forage. Um, so land enough for animals who to rewild themselves would certainly be something that I would love. But I think I'm focused. I tend to be focused more on the nearer term.
That makes sense. Yeah, there's certainly enough in hand to deal with. I'm yeah, a lot of the animal rights world thinks a lot about um, ideas that might be lumped in with like effective altruism, and kind of the idea is trying to do the most amount of good per dollar in a
Oh,
quantifiable way.
God help
Um,
us.
and I remember a few years ago I was writing a story for a class about sanctuaries, and I talked with someone from, I think it was Animal Charity Evaluators or some group, who told me that he did not necessarily think of sanctuaries as an effective form of animal advocacy because it could take a lot of money to care for a single animal. But I think there are also sort of some pretty valid critiques and pushbacks against this type of thinking. And so, for you, like, how do you think about, and it may or may not have anything to do with what that other guy told me, but how do you think about like what makes this worthwhile for you? What makes co-founding, fundraising for, doing podcasts about a sanctuary worthwhile?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that animal charity evaluators did great harm to many sanctuaries and has not yet taken responsibility for doing so, much less thought about what reparations might look like. Um, Virtually every sanctuary, including us, are struggling because of effective altruism. There's a new book that's called The Good It Promises, The Harm It Does, which is edited by Lori Gruen, Alice Clary, and Carol J. Adams, and which includes essays from philosophers, from activists, including three of us from sanctuaries, including former effective altruists. It's a really important book, and I encourage anyone who has any thoughts at all about effective altruism, positive or negative, to read that book and be open to the ideas in it, uh, which collectively are pretty devastating.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm certainly capable of listing all of the ways that sanctuaries in general and the very unique multi-species community that is Vine Sanctuary um, are useful projects in the world, each doing their own way of doing the work. Here, we have scholars coming all the time to study how the animals
Mm-hmm.
are interacting with one another. I don't want to be like, okay, so that makes it worthwhile,
Yes.
because that in itself is denigrating, right?
Mm-hmm.
We When there is a war on somebody, the very least you can do is create some safe spaces for survivors. And as far as I'm concerned, even if we didn't do anything other than that, that would be an entirely worthy thing to do. And to say otherwise is unthinkably callous, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
saying, well, I mean, why send a fire truck to put out a fire when, well, just let them burn and, put all your money into fire safety prevention. I mean, you probably can. You probably could prevent more fires by spending that money that way. But in a case like that, we understand. Collectively, we need to do both.
Mm-hmm.
Collectively, we need to do both. We all can get to choose where we're going to put our personal time and resources. But to go around denigrating the projects of others, trying deliberately to steer money away from animal rescue, trying deliberately to defund sanctuaries. And that's what EA has done. Don't be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Trying deliberately to defund the very few refuges that exist for the survivors. That to me is very close to evil.
Yeah, it seems to me that these animals are here, they're alive, and to not care for and create a space for them, you know, it does. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be useful to do that. It's a thing worth doing on its own because they are, their own selves, and just like any other self would deserve the same.
And this idea, but again, I don't want to, I don't want to go down the road of justifying it,
Mm-hmm.
of like saying, oh, well, we're worthwhile because of this. But I do have to point out that human beings at present, first of all, have have collectively failed to solve any of our internal problems within our species. We haven't solved poverty, we haven't solved war, we haven't solved hunger, despite the best efforts of some of the best educated and in some cases most politically powerful people. That's been going on for centuries. Now, here we are in the midst of a climate emergency caused by humans, and humans are collectively failing abysmally to solve it. So, this idea that like humans are the smartest and we can, with our little algorithms, figure out what's the best thing to do in all circumstances, what's the most cost effective thing to do in all circumstances, what's the most effective thing to do in all circumstances. Oh my goodness, the hubris, the
Mm-hmm.
cluelessness, the absolute failure to see the facts of the matter. So there's lots of other species, none of which have created climate change. Many of which have figured out how to live with each other equitably, internally and across species.
Mm-hmm.
What could we learn from them? Isn't it smart to maybe have some places where they can be themselves, where we might be able to learn from them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I I wanted to ask, maybe slightly tangentially, but maybe not, that sort of VINE is an acronym that I understand stands for two different things. Um, and I'm curious if you could talk about them and why they're important.
Sure, sure. Vine stands for veganism is the next evolution, but it also stands for veganism is not enough. And by veganism is the next evolution, what we mean is that whatever your primary focus is, whether that be animals, whether that be environment, whether that be social justice, because of all of the intersecting connections among various forms of oppression, veganism is something you need to do. It's a next step for you. Uh, Whatever, if you're someone who's hoping for the world to become more equitable, peaceful, sustainable, then veganism is gonna be the next evolution for you. And we do see veganism as a praxis rather than a obtained identity, something that's always ongoing. But it's not enough any more than it would be enough to say, well, uh, I'm going to refrain from battering women, and that makes me a feminist. So we have to do other things. Veganism is a baseline. And for many of us, it's a fairly easy ask. And part of what we need to do is make it true that it becomes easier for everybody. There are, of course, many people right now for whom access to food is sharply circumscribed. And so one of the things we need to do is make veganism easy for everybody by collaborating with the food justice movement and the environmental justice movement, etc. But for those of us who can, then veganism is the next step, or a next step, but not enough.
Hmm. Yeah.
And really, we wouldn't necessarily have centered the name on veganism, except that we really liked Vine as an acronym because we
um,
love vines. We love how vines make connections. We love how vines can pull down human built walls. We love how vines can feed humans and other animals. We just love everything about vines.
I don't blame you. Um, yeah, maybe one more. You mentioned earlier how you look at dairy as a feminist issue,
Hmm.
um, and you mentioned feminism a couple times. And just for those who haven't thought about it yet, uh, I'm wondering if you can draw that connection out for listeners.
Ooh. For dairy in particular? Sure.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, the linkages between sexism and speciesism are very, very deep and go back, to the days, which are still true in some places, where husbands were the owners of not only land and animals, but also women and children. Um,
Hmm.
and if we think a little too, if we think at all closely about things like, I don't know, grooms putting rings on brides, then we really see how deep it goes. But let's go away from that and just say, look, for dairy, I understand a lot of people don't realize it. I know a lot of people who are vegetarian because they don't want to kill animals, but they still consume dairy because they have these ideas based on the advertising that's been served to them, not only in the media, but in the public schools here in the United States, that dairy is harmless and that cows are happy about it. But in fact, cows are mammals just like we are. They only produce milk after they've given birth, and they only produce it so long as the child is suckling, and then they naturally stop producing milk. So what does the dairy industry do? Well, the dairy industry first forcibly impregnates cows as soon as they are sexually mature, and then after the calf is born, the mother cow is allowed to be with the calf uh, only long enough for her milk to start flowing, typically less than 24 hours. And then the calf is taken away. The mother protests often, moans afterwards, sinks into depression afterwards. When the calf is taken away, if the calf is male, the calf may be just shot, or may be sold to a veal uh, farm. If the calf is female, she'll be kept separate from her mother and raised on a milk substitute until she reaches the age of sexual maturity, where either she'll be sold to another farm or right on the same farm. The process will start for her. So then the cows are milked typically by being hooked up to machines twice a day. The machines braid their teats. It's a deeply violating and often painful experience. And because it happens consistently, it's as though the calf is suckling consistently, and she will continue to produce milk for up to a year or more, because she would nurse a calf for that long. Eventually, she'll start to produce less milk, in which case then she will be impregnated again, and she will um, be divested of her calf again and hooked up to the machines again. She will probably develop mastitis, which is a painful inflammation. It makes the whole thing more painful. Eventually, she'll either stop being able to be made pregnant, or her milk production will decline. On the big factory farms, they will just sort of automatically cull, meaning kill, meaning send to slaughter for low grade meat. cows at a particular age. On the smaller scale farms, they may keep them for a long time. One cow here, Autumn, who only died last year, came to us at age 12, having had 9 calves taken from her at a dairy farm.
Mhm.
Our eldest cow now, Rose, had 6 or 7 taken from her at a small scale dairy farm over the course of about 9 years. Um,
Yeah.
it's 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 a deep violation in every way. It's a sexual violation in the course of the impregnation. Um, it's an intimate violation, the milking every day. A couple few times we've had cows come here right from a dairy with such bad mastitis that we couldn't just let them naturally have less milk, uh, naturally stop producing milk. What we would have to do is milk them out and then squirt antibiotics up. And so I've actually had the experience of milking out a cow by hand, knowing that I was doing this to save her life from the mastitis because she needed the medicine, and yet still feeling what an enormously intimate violation it was to have my hands on that part of her body, squeezing it to get the milk out. It's really obscene, the entire industry. And I know that most people still don't realize that. So we have a lot of work to do to make the really basic facts about dairy evident. So many people still don't know. And also to inculcate empathy for the cows. Empathy for the cows is what we need. Because I think if people have that empathy, um, then it's pretty hard to participate in something that obscene.
Yeah. I think, sometimes a stereotype of vegans can be that they are city dwellers who don't actually know what it's like on a farm, but I think it's striking, to hear your your passion about this issue is coming from someone who knows cows better than who spends, your time among these other animals and have been able to develop that empathy. And I think the contrast between the you know system of regimented exploitation that you described and your description earlier in this podcast of trying to make a space on Vine Sanctuary that is truly multi-species and influenced by the animal's own interests, and
And
is
yes,
yeah, it's a striking contrast.
yeah, and listen, I mean, Autumn came here after 9 years at 12 years at a dairy, having 9 calves taken from her. And while she was here, she lived to be um, over 20, maybe 23, 21 at least. And in her years here, she adopted calves twice, calves who had been discarded from dairies and came to the sanctuary. She became a leader, widely esteemed leader of the multi-species community, respected by cows, respected by sheep and goats, respected by humans. She had her best friend Rose, who's still with us. She had her dignity, um, and uh, and many moments of joy and happiness. And there's not a way to calculate what that means,
Mhm.
but I think it's important.
Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but I don't want to keep you too long.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to add or discuss?
I would like to invite your listeners to visit us at vinesanctuary.org, where you can learn more about Vine, where you can support the sanctuary if you like, and sign up for the Vine Book Club. If you're a listener to this podcast, then you like books. You probably would like to read the books that we read at Vine Book Club, which is a virtual book club with something like 300 members around the world,
Oh wow.
not all of whom come to every meeting,
Hmm.
But you never know. At our last meeting, we had activists from not only the US, but the UK, Greece, Estonia, Mexico, and India were present. So it's fascinating conversations and fascinating books. So you can go to vinesanctuary.org and look for Vine Book Club. And again, think about supporting the sanctuary.
I will include a link to your website in the episode description.
Great.
So people can do that. And Patrice, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the Patreon subscribers who keep this podcast going. Thanks to everyone who likes or follows this podcast. Patrice briefly mentioned Alice Crary and Lori Gruen, two of the editors of the new book on effective altruism she mentioned. For those who don't recall or are new to the podcast, I interviewed Alice and Lori about a year ago, so I'm including a link to that podcast as well below in case you're curious to hear more from them. We didn't talk about effective altruism so much in that, but you can hear more about their other ideas. In terms of what's next for this podcast, our 4-part series on animal agency is now concluded, except for, as I mentioned, the book club. If you want to join the book club, there's more information in the links below. The easiest ways to follow along are either to subscribe on Patreon or subscribe to my free weekly newsletter. And then I'll be pivoting to a new series on the trouble with car dependency and some of the environmental problems posed by our extreme reliance on automobiles and some of the possible ways out of this quagmire. You might think this is a bit of a left turn, so to speak, from animal agency, but I promise it actually will come together eventually, because one of the episodes I'm doing is about the impacts of road upon wildlife. And when you think about it, all the roads and driving in this country are a primary means of thwarting animal agency. It means it's less safe for your dog to go outside. It means it's harder for mountain lions to migrate. It means a million things. So eventually we'll get to that and possible ways to reduce the negative impacts and help wild animals and domestic deal with cars. But yeah, next episode in a couple weeks we'll be starting more big picture with the trouble with cars. And as a reminder, Patreon subscribers get to listen early to all these episodes. I've already done a couple of the interviews, but if you just want to wait and listen for free, I get it. Hope you're having a good day.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.